let's start at the beginning. You originally planned to be a minister. How did you decide to become a lawyer?
Well, before I answer your question, let me first express to the Dean my appreciation for the remarks he made, and to you, and to the law school, and to Rosa, and to the Law Review for making this trip possible. And to all of you students, I just want to say to you that over 60 years ago, I sat where you're sitting, not in this building, but in the old building on the Delbert. Had no idea that I would ever be coming back to this institution under these circumstances. And I say that to you because you sit and you listen now and wonder what's going to happen to you. But I hope that my coming to this university and the story of my life will help you as you try to determine what you're going to do with your own career. It's good to see Attorney Hopper back there, and I have a friend, Charles Chambers, the young man back there who's originally from Macon County, Alabama, and who worked with us a great deal down there. He's back here now, came back to Cleveland about 2 or 3 weeks ago. He called me the other day, and I told him I was going to be here, so he's here, and I'm happy that they're here. I'm happy that each of you. Having said that, I will now, Professor, try to answer your question. And sometimes when you're trying a case and you ask a question, if you are fortunate enough to get a judge who will let you make a speech, you go ahead and make your speech because it may have an effect on the jury if it doesn't have an effect on the judge. I was born in Montgomery, Alabama, which is the cradle of the Confederacy, in the middle of the Depression in 1930. The youngest of 5 children. My father died when I was 2. My mother had no formal education, only about 5th or 6th grade. But she told us, the 5 of us, that we could be anything we wanted to be if we did 3 things. 1, keep Christ first in our lives. 2, stay in school and get a good education. And 3, stay out of trouble. Don't get involved in the criminal justice system. I tried to do that, and I tried to instill that into my 4 children, and I hope I did that, and I hope that their children will also be so inspired. But when I was coming along in Alabama in the 40s as a teenager, there was probably only about, and you wouldn't know this, your parents would know it though, there's about 2 professions that a black African-American boy could look forward to as being professions that he was well respected for being. And you probably could help me guess. One of those would be to be a what?
Teacher.
What?
Teacher.
A teacher, that's one. And the other one would be what? A preacher. And you taught, or you was a preacher, under in a segregated system. If you were black, you preached to black people in the black church. If you were a teacher, you taught black children in a black school. So I decided I was going to be both. So when I was growing up, my mother's side used to baptize cats and dogs. We had a school, a Church of Christ related school up in Nashville. It was a boarding school. So when I was 12 years old, I went up to that school to learn how to be a preacher. And apparently I did pretty good because the president of the school, one of our old evangelists, would go around and raise funds at churches across the country. And he decided one way of raising funds and soliciting students was to take a student along, 1 or 2 students with him, let them serve as boy preachers, preach ahead of him, make a little statement. And then he would tell the audience, these are the type of boys that we produce. You send your son to us, we'll send him back a good man, and he'll be good and make a contribution to the school. And that's what I did. I was one of his first boy preachers, and throughout the Southeast, from Texas to Florida, all around, and I did that. I finished there in 1948. Came back to Montgomery, enrolled in Alabama State College. Actually, the name of it then was Alabama State College for Negroes, the historical black school in Montgomery. I lived on the west side of town. Alabama State was located and still is on the east side of town. I had to use the public transportation system from as little as twice a day to as much as 8 times a day. I saw many of our people who were mistreated on the buses. Sometimes when white people would come on and the bus would become full, they would take your money in the front door, you go in the back door, and sometimes the bus driver, I wouldn't say he intentionally did it, but sometimes before a person could get in the back door, he's closed it and gone. Everything at that time was completely segregated. We had a family friend whose name was E.D. Nixon. He was a Pullman car porter by profession. He had been president of the state conference of branches in the state of Alabama for the NAACP. He had also been the president of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. And if a person of color had any racial problems, he would usually contact E.D. Nixon. And I had seen him try to help our people, and he was having difficulty finding lawyers. If a person of color had a cause of action against a white person, there was almost no justice to be received. First of all, there were no black lawyers, and white lawyers would be afraid to accept those kinds of cases. I made a personal secret commitment while I was a junior at Alabama State, and that is I was going to finish state. I was going to go to somebody's law school someplace, and at that time, the state of Alabama, along with all the other southern states, if a course were offered at the historical white school, Auburn, University of Alabama in Alabama, and not offered at Alabama State, Alabama A&M, or Tuskegee, historical black schools in the state, then the state would pay a portion of their tuition, room, and board. I decided I was going to go to somebody's law school, finish law school, return to Alabama, pass the bar exam. I wanted to go to a good small law school, and I received information about any number of law schools, including this one. In addition to that, I had to also go to a school where I could find some work, because we didn't have any student loans at that time. I knew I was not smart enough to get an academic scholarship to anybody's law school. And I realized that I had to support, my mother was not able to do it. There were no student loans. And Cleveland, in the early 50s, the illuminating company used to have a slogan saying Cleveland was the best location in the nation. If you wanted to find a job, particularly a person of color, whether it was part-time or full-time, you could usually get one in in Cleveland. Plus, there were a lot of Alabamians who had migrated from Alabama, who was living in Cleveland. Many of them had sent back and got their relatives, and they all had jobs, and I had some relatives here at the time. Then, in addition to that, then, unlike now, all of the classes were between 8:30 in the morning and 12:20 in the afternoon. So
You
I
can
felt,
blame me for that.
I felt that that would give me enough time that I could find a job and work a few hours and at the same time be able to keep up with my schoolwork. And the selection was made to attend this law school, and I'm glad I did. I was a member of the branch of the NAACP and very active because I was interested in civil rights activities. Mrs. Parks was very interested in youth, very interested in civil rights, and became very interested in my career as a lawyer. She worked in a department store in downtown Montgomery that was located a block and a half from where my office was located. So from the time I started practicing until the day of her arrest, almost every work day, and that was 5 days a week, during her lunch period, she would bring her little lunch to my office and we would sit down and we would talk. We talked about conditions on the buses. We talked about the conditions of young people generally. We talked about the whole racial problems and how it could be solved. We also talked about how a person should conduct themselves in the event they had an opportunity to challenge or were asked to give up their seats on the buses. So Mrs. Parks was very much familiar with our conferences, and even on the day of her arrest, we had talked that day. I was the last person that she had seen that had anything to do with civil rights. But she also knew that I was going to be out of town that afternoon. And it just happened that when she went home, the opportunity presented itself where she was sitting not in one of the 10 seats reserved, but one of the others. And she refused to get up to give her seat. And when I came from out of town, I had messages from her and from my secretary and everybody telling me that Mrs. Parks had been arrested. I returned Mrs. Parks' call, and she asked me to come over to her house. And I went over and talked with her. She told me what had taken place. This was on a Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening. And she wanted me to represent her. The trial was going to be the following Monday in the Recorder's Court of the city of Montgomery. I told her I would. And for her not to worry about it, we would be ready for her trial on Monday. I left her house and went to Mr. E.D. Nixon's house. It wasn't very far. We discussed her case because he already knew about it, because he had known about Claudette's case. He had gotten me involved in that one. He was the one who went and actually signed the bond for Mrs. Parks to get out of jail. And I told him then that if we're going to ever do anything about the buses, the time to do it is now. And I knew he was ready for that, and he said, well, fine. Now, Mr. Nixon was not a person who did a lot of planning. He was an action type person. So I told him that I was going to go and talk to Ms. Robinson, because she was interested in Claudette's case, and she had had an experience, a bad experience on the buses. I left E.D. Nixon's house, drove across town to Mrs. Robinson's house. Got there about 9 o'clock in the evening. And from 9 o'clock on the evening of December 1st until the early hours of December 2nd, we sat in her living room and planned the details for the Montgomery bus boycott. There were several things we considered. Number one, if we're going to ever solve the bus problems in Montgomery, now is the time to do it. Two, I felt that we were going to ultimately have to file a federal lawsuit in order to do it, because the state courts in Alabama was not going to rule in our favor. I just knew that. And I also realized it takes a long time for lawsuits to begin initially in the district court and get a definitive decision in the Supreme Court. So the question is, what are we going to do in the meantime? Joanne says what we ought to do is stay off of the buses until we can return on a non-segregated basis. But, she says, that's going to take planning, that's going to take money, that's going to take a lot of work. I said, well, what else do we need to decide? I said, well, if we're going to, let's try to tell the people on the day that Mrs. Parks' trial, December the 5th, let's stay off of the bus at least for one day as a protest. And Joanne said, well, that's fine. She said, now I know you all going to have a lot of meetings, but I'm going to, when we get through with our meeting here, I'm going to go and draft leaflets that's going to say another black woman has been arrested. Her trial is going to be on Monday the 5th of December. Stay off of the bus in protest, and there'll be a mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church on December 5th. Now, she didn't know all those things could happen, and neither did I, but those were the plans. Then the question is, if we're going to do that, how are we going to get the message out? This is now Friday morning, and we're talking about Monday. We said, well, the black preachers talk to more black people on Sunday morning than anybody else. So we've got to get the cooperation of the black preachers. I said, I don't think that'll be a problem. We know all the preachers. I think we can get them to cooperate with us. But there's some other things we need to do too. The question is going to come up, while you're staying off of the bus, you're going to need a spokesman. So who is going to be the spokesman? And that was a real challenge, because under normal circumstances, the spokesman would have been E.D. Nixon. E.D. Nixon was not an educated man, but he was the Mr. Civil Rights, and he had a lot of people following him. But there was also another black leader in Montgomery named Rufus Lewis. Rufus Lewis was only concerned about one area of civil rights, and that is to get people registered to vote and get people elected to public office. If you had that kind of problem, he would be interested in it. If there's any other kind of problem, he was not. He had a nightclub, and the nightclub was named the Citizens Club. And in order to get in the Citizens Club, you had to be a registered voter. So we said, well, we need Mr. Nixon's supporters and we need Mr. Lewis's supporters. If either one of them is appointed as the spokesman, we may lose somebody supporters. Why don't we come up with another person who will be the spokesman and give good supporting roles to these two men? Joanne said, I tell you, Fred, who we should get. She said, my pastor, Martin Luther King Jr., has not been here long. He's pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. As you know, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is the last church that you would expect a boycott to start, because it was elite black people who lived there. Most of them had jobs by the state or the city or the county, and their positions were vulnerable, and they weren't going to do anything that was going to interfere with them. She said, but he's a good speaker, and he will be able to move people with words. I had met Dr. King, and I told her, but I don't know her like you do. If you think, that's fine. I said, well, I can tell you two key roles for the other two men. She said, what? E.D. Nixon is a Pullman car puller. This group is going to need to raise some money. He needs to be the treasurer. He knows A. Philip Randolph, the black labor leader in New York, who's president of his Pullman car puller union. That means he could get him to raise the money if E.D. Dixon is treasurer. She said, fine. But what are we going to do with Rufus Lewis and the Citizens Club? I said, well, there's another thing. Rufus Lewis is married to Jewel, who was a Clayton. And she is co-owner of the largest funeral home in town. Ross Clayton Funeral Home was the largest then in Montgomery, and is still the largest now. They have automobiles. We're going to need to get people from one place to another place. So we're going to need to have a transportation system. Let's make Mr. Lewis chairman of the transportation committee. He'll get his wife to get all the cars. They'll get others, and we'll have a transportation system. And the only other thing left you need is a lawyer. And the young lawyer just finished a case at Western Reserve University then, just out of law school, would be the lawyer. We decided, one, Joanne couldn't let it be known that she was doing all this at the time because she worked for a state institution and they would have fired her. Well, she got fired anyway, but it was much later. I just have been a member of the bar for less than a year, and if it gets out that I'm stirring up litigation, they'll disbar me before I get started. So what we had to do was plant the seeds, the plans that we had in other individuals' minds, and let those individuals be the one to get the message to other individuals. And when it spread it, now Joanne said, now, I'm going to go on and make these leaflets and get them out. When they had the official meeting, Martin Luther King Jr. was selected to be the spokesman at a meeting, and at the time they elected him, he was not present. Rufus Lewis